June 2nd, 2022. We're at Elizabethtown College here in the High Library, interviewing Karen JohnsonWeiner. I'm Rachel Grove Rohrbaugh, and I'm the archivist here at Elizabethtown College, and we're joined by Emily Erdlen, a student here at Elizabethtown. So we'll just start with some background questions, just to get a sense of where you began. So tell us about your background and education. Where'd you grow up? And then how did you come to study linguistic anthropology?
Well, I grew up in Michigan, did a BA in French and History at Hope College in Holland, Michigan. Went to Michigan State for an MA in English and English as a second language, intending to teach English to non-native speakers for my career. Went overseas, came back, joined my now husband in upstate New York, and went to McGill University for my PhD, which was going to be in linguistics. And I got sidetracked sort of into doing neurolinguistics. So I spent a lot of time testing stroke patients and others to look at the organization of language in the brain. By the time I finished my dissertation and was ready to settle down, I also had a newborn. And so was not going to be going off to Syracuse and testing stroke patients regularly. And didn't really know what I was going to do because there wasn't a lot of call for neurolinguistics in the wilds of St. Lawrence County. And then we went to buy a picnic table. And, you know, we were family, we needed a picnic table. So I took my infant son, who was dressed in horizontal primary color stripes, and we went out to this Amish family. Everybody said, "Oh, go see the Amish to buy your picnic table." And it was a young woman who had a baby that looked about the same age as my son Seth. And she called her husband in from the field, and he came in, and I thought, whoa, they're not speaking English. They must be speaking Pennsylvania Dutch. How can that be in upstate New York? I knew nothing. But the idea that they were speaking this other language not very far away really interested me. And so I decided to start reading about the Amish and to discover more about these people. And it was hard. I mean, there wasn't much in the library. This is 1984. And St. Lawrence University, SUNY Potsdam, hadn't devoted major resources to compiling an Amish collection or a Mennonite collection. I knew nothing about Amish. I knew nothing about Mennonites. I got a hold of John Hostetler's book, Amish Society, and that's where I started. And then I needed to meet somebody who could tell me about these people and the language. I was very interested in the language. And from then on, I was hooked. I had a student introduce me to one Amish woman in a town 20 minutes to one side of Canton, which is where we were living. And another person introduced me to another woman 20 minutes in the opposite direction. What did I know? There were two Amish women. Only later did I discover that they were from very different groups. They spoke very different versions of Pennsylvania Dutch. They had very different outlooks. They dressed completely differently. I'll never forget asking the daughter of this first woman I met, you know, how do you tell each other apart? And she looked at me like I was nuts. And I would look at me like I'm nuts. You know, the caps were different, the dress was different, the colors were different, the shoes were, everything. But that was my start with Amish studies. It was really the language.
It was very organic, it sounds like. Mm-hmm. You were just one person, another person, started with this chance encounter.
Yep. And snowballed from there. I've always sort of learned, you know, met people doing something that a previous meeting had let me do.
Interesting. So much of your research is based on participant observation, so establishing relationships, which you've already started to touch on that because you're meeting people and making these connections. Do you remember your first Amish friend?
Oh, yeah.
And are you still in touch with this person?
She passed away, sadly. Now, that was the first woman The first woman I met was a woman named Sue Ann Wiki, and there are lots of letters from her in the file. She was probably in her early 60s. I thought she was a widow when I first met her. She had one daughter living at home still, who I learned was adopted. Sue was a midwife. She had been part of a settlement in Belize. She'd adopted this daughter in Belize. She was living next door to another daughter who was married to a minister in the town of Norfolk, New York. Sue wanted to teach me Deutsch, Pennsylvania German, but the community was Swiss, so I was learning Deutsch and Schweizer I learned Deutsch from Sue, who would correct all of her children, who would teach me Schweizer. And Sue was just an amazing woman. Midwife, she delivered a number of her own grandchildren. Feisty, to say the least. Sad to say, the last time I saw her, I knew that she wouldn't be with us much longer, partially because she was so sweet. I mean, she had not been a sweet personality, and just loved her dearly. The second woman, and I met her about the same time, we are still friends. She no longer lives close to me. She lives in Pulaski, New York. And Fanny and I are the same age. When I met Fanny, I had my infant son. She had 6 children. The youngest was roughly the age of my son. She went on to have, 4 more. I went on to have 1 more. And my kids grew up with her kids. And I got to know her sisters. Her father was a bishop. When I started researching schools and was going out to Ohio, they said, "Oh, you have to stop by this person and go see this person." So they gave me entree into lives of other people, and that's how my work went. I have to say, I was not trained to be a linguistic anthropologist. I was doing neurolinguistics. I got my research approved by the IRB and went in with my series of questions and talked to stroke patients, and there was no participant observation whatsoever. When I realized what I was going to be doing, I went back and took a couple of anthropology courses just to prepare me for what was suddenly happening in my research. But yeah, of those first 2 people, one is still a treasured friend, and one is a treasured memory. Yeah. So,
seems like also too that led to a lot of other connections.
Absolutely,
one person would lead to, and mainly women.
Primarily women, though. I've gotten, it's like, at first I wondered, I'd be sitting there having coffee with the women, and the men would come in. And at first I thought, oh, they're checking me out, they're making sure, Then I realized, no, they wanted a cup of coffee too, and we joke around and get to know them, and I'd joke around and get to know them, and they just became part of who I was hanging out with. And then when the women's work started again, if we were taking a break from peeling peaches, they'd go back out to their work, and we'd sit there and peel peaches and talk, and it, especially in the beginning, when I had notions about the Amish, very patriarchal, and women do this and men do that, it revealed to me how intertwined men and women's lives were, especially in those very, very conservative families. I didn't know what kind of Amish I was dealing with initially. And my first trip to Lancaster was kind of shocking. I didn't know that I was dealing with among the most conservative people. What I saw were farming families where husbands would come in, have coffee, help out if they were needed. We were working together.
So what really surprised you when you came to Lancaster and saw those? I mean, I can think of many things, but what in particular? Well,
my first, I gave a talk down here, and the title of the talk was "Home is Where the Church Is," or something like that. And it talked about these 2 groups which had moved. They'd settled in upstate New York in the early to mid 70s. And at the beginning, I didn't understand what moving meant. I mean, it's only over time that I came to understand moving as a conservative choice to protect the way of life of the church. And so I gave this talk where I was expounding as if I knew something about groups that really were not attached to the land, but were attached to the church and could move the church. And people said, but Lancaster people don't move. Lancaster people establish businesses. Lancaster people do that. I read Don's book, Riddles, and was going, oh, these are very different. They have a different attitude towards place. They have a different attitude towards what you do and how you change. And so, things were shocking. The use of drivers, going shopping, the wearing of sandals, of little things like that. But I realized that these really reflected a different way of being Amish, and that's when I became aware of how much diversity there was, and trying to understand that diversity became part of what I was doing. So
this is off the list of questions we had first, but it's trying to make me wonder. So I think your first full-length book on the Amish was on Amish and Mennonite schools. Is
right.
that correct?
Right.
So how did that sort of evolve from what you were initially doing, which was more language-based?
Well, the language stuff had morphed. I was still trying to do this dictionary. Dick Beam had done the dictionaries. Well, I didn't need to do. I was working with a German professor, and we were going to do this Swiss Deutsch English dictionary, and neither of us had our hearts in it after a while. What was much more interesting to me, I'd started sitting in on schools, and I thought, these schools are in English. These people, have been here a long time. They haven't followed the typical immigrant model whereby the third generation, you've got the immigrants who never really learn English, then you've got the maybe born in this country, maybe born soon after, who are bilingual but mostly English, and then you've got the third generation that's English speaking and doesn't know the name. These people, German is still there after generations, yet they're going to school all in English. Their reading and writing is in English. How are they preserving language? And that became the focus of my work, not the language itself. How are they preserving culture? How are they preserving language? And I began to look at the schools to see how did they contribute to that, because education was in English. All their reading and writing, they didn't start learning to do German until third grade. And so I'd done a paper on preserving language in the schools. And it was here at Elizabethtown. Don Crable said, let's have lunch. Now I was in awe. I'd read his book. Don Crable was he was the person. So I was first of all in awe that he knew me, and then wanted to sit down. And he said, the anniversary of Wisconsin versus Yoder is coming up. He said, there needs to be a book about schools. I had never thought of myself as writing a book. I was still teaching English as a second language. I wasn't, the research was fun, but it was only slowly becoming a career for me. He says there needs to be a book on schools. I think you should write it. And I went, oh, okay. And so it just sort of grew. Mark DeWalt covered schools in every place there are Amish. I didn't do that. I really drew on connections. I've been coming down here to Lancaster, to still doing language, to work in Amos Hoover's Muddy Creek Library. I knew old order Mennonites and had visited a couple older Mennonite schools. So they just became part of it. It wasn't ever just Amish. I'd been, doing research at Pathway Library, the Heritage Historical Library, and so the publishing seemed a natural part of it. I started with North Country schools, the Schwarzenchuber schools, the Swiss schools, but they knew people out in Ohio, out in Kentucky, out in Indiana, out in Michigan. I had, this one close friend, Sue Ann, had moved to Michigan. She was a school teacher. I went and visited schools with her in Indiana. So it just came about. I'd like to say there was an orderly plan to it. But even how I covered schools evolved as I was covering them. I began to see things that I hadn't seen just sitting in on classes in New York. I saw those things differently in Ohio, and had the chance to, I had a car. I could give rides to people. So in Ohio, I began traveling with several Amish teachers, and we would stay different places. That was a treat and a half. When we'd pull up at someone's home that nobody knew, but they basically say, "Can we order lunch here?" And I'm like, wow, this is kind of different from how I'm used to doing things. When you go to use the house and your travel companions come right in with you because it's a 3-seater, you learn to do things differently. And so the research evolved. And I warned you I would ramble. So I don't even know where you started with that question.
Just the evolution from the language study.
But that's how it really was. It was asking how why are they still speaking the language? What does language have to do with the culture? What does culture have to do with being Amish? And it all boiled down to faith. What I was reading at the time was that language protects the church. And I came to understand that was backwards. All you had to do was look at groups that had changed, and language disappeared. You look at people who left the Amish, language disappeared. Language wasn't protecting anything. It was the church that was protecting the aggregate of behaviors that were Amish. It was church that said, if you're Amish to follow the Ordnung, you're doing this, 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 and this. And one of those thises was speaking Deutsch, was using the language. And so language, I began to see it, as a fence. It establishes the boundary between us and them. But that boundary is put in place by the Ordnung and by the church. And the more I understood that being Amish means you're really always in church. You're doing activities that are defined by the Ordnung. And that means you're putting on particular kinds of socks. It means you're cooking on particular kinds of stoves. You're doing laundry in particular ways, and you're speaking a particular kind of language.
It's affecting every aspect.
Everything. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So we've already touched on the schools, but you've also written books on the New York Amish, more recently Amish Women. You were also part of the team that wrote the 2013 survey of the Amish. Over all these years of research, what has surprised you the most about playing with Anabaptist groups?
Several things. Diversity, which I've already mentioned. How different, and I tried to bring that out in the book about women. In asking the question, is a woman in Indiana who works in a factory, who's grown up in a home where there was running water and indoor plumbing and linoleum floors, who never had to, wait for the bathtub on Saturday night. Is that woman Amish in the same way as a woman who's grown up fetching wood for the wood stove, pumping water? Are they Amish? And certainly not in the same way what makes them Amish. What is Amishness? So the diversity, and then how that diversity is revealed in attitudes about life, about family, about work, about English neighbors. The role of women, because, as I said, I read that the Amish are a patriarchal society and the wife is the helpmeet. I mean, yeah, she helps, he helps, but the way in which women are partners with their spouses and how that was influenced by the diversity of Amish life. That in the most conservative group where men and women are working together across generational lines, women were seeing themselves in relation to their spouses differently than in communities where, once she's married, she's at home with the children, dad's gone off to work, he's not there at lunch, there aren't chores to keep the kids busy, you're not preserving food in the same way. So I can't say it's one thing. It was the diversity and the way in which that diversity was revealed in understandings of Amishness. And it was always interesting for me to come down, and working on the Amish work with Don and Steve, because they were based and had a lot of their interactions with communities that were much more progressive, much more, it's hard to say assimilated because that suggests that boundaries aren't there anymore, and they are, but much more technologically similar to their English neighbors. And they'd be saying, yeah, and the Amish do this and this and this, and I go, yoo-hoo, can we remember the Schwarzentroopers who don't do any of that, who don't have phone booths, who won't use cell phones, whose children aren't on Facebook, who don't even like to talk on the phone and have they'll make someone else call me and ask me for the ride. I always felt like my role was reinforcing that diversity, was saying, hey, let's remember these guys.
I didn't think about that, how important to have you as part of that team of writers to have that perspective.
I didn't think of myself in that role at all, except for Don came up to do research, to visit the Schwarzentroopers, and I took him around, and his comment was, I need to rewrite the books. He'd come out with Riddle, and I'm going, wait a minute, my people, very possessive about Schwarzentroopers, aren't in these books. They're not here. These are the people that are moving so they don't have to change. You could write about business in Lancaster. You could write about the lunch pail problem in Indiana. Schwarzentroopers don't have that. They're moving, and consequently, they're establishing settlements all over. And they're having 10 to 15 children. They're a growing Amish population. They're increasingly in conflict with the legal system, because if you move so you don't change, you're not going to change just because they don't like how you do things in the new area you've moved to. And so, the diversity in all its ramifications for me has been the most surprising thing.
So that brings up a question. So in another interview I read earlier this year, you said you're retired now from active research. But if you would write another book, it would be on the Schwarzentrooper Amish. I think you've already touched on this, but maybe you can expand on it. What particularly fascinates you about that group? Their
determination to be separate, not to, I don't want to say they don't change, because they absolutely do. I've seen changes in the community closest to me, resulting in several schisms, so that they absolutely change, but it's that determination. And they're settling relatively far from urban centers. So people don't know them. When outsiders think of the Amish, they're thinking of that trip they made to Lancaster County. They're thinking of visiting Shipshewana. And so when Schwarzenschubers come and establish a new settlement, they're totally unprepared for who these Amish are, because the books aren't about these Amish. That's why I hope that, our study, The Amish, really shows that diversity, because it's not there in mass media. They're seeing Rumspringa. Schwarzenschubers don't do Rumspringa like that. They're seeing, young people interacting much more with English world. So the Schwarzenschubers are an unknown, or relatively unknown, relatively misunderstood because they're not known, yet increasingly widespread segment of the Amish population. And I think somebody should be writing about them. I hope somebody will be writing about them. The problem is they're also more isolated, not just geographically, but technologically. You can't call them up. You can't send them an email. It's hard to get to know them. I was fortunate in that I lived relatively close by and spent several days a week sitting in Schwarzenschuber homes and peeling peaches and helping with butcherings and things like that. You have to spend time with Schwarzenschubers. And you have to be willing to travel to get the entire, talk about diversity, the entire diversity of Schwarzenschubers. I was just, pre-COVID, was out in Minnesota, in Canton, Minnesota, which was odd, where they were having issues having to do with gray water disposal. And there were, 5 church districts out there. No, 6 church districts out there, 5 that fellowshipped with each other, and a 6th that was known as the most conservative district out there. So I go out to Minnesota, and here are Schwarzenschubers, clearly Schwarzenschubers. That 6th most conservative district fellowshipped with what are called Joe Troyer Schwarzenschubers, which is the most progressive of the Schwarzenschubers by us. So you've got a diversity, again, that's not really understood or appreciated. And then I met other sort of the Perry Glick people, who are Schwarzenschuber. They're relatives of the people I see, but are again different. So the Schwarzenschubers need to be studied. Somebody needs to do it. It's going to take a true commitment of time and effort and money, and those are all things not in great supply. But that's why I think that book needs to be written by somebody else.
So your mention of the gray water dispute made me think about, particularly since they are groups that are going to move to more remote locations, might be less understood. Does that lead to more conflict with local? Yeah.
Well, you had the case in Pennsylvania where Schwarzenschubers ran afoul of the law for septic. It's not gray water, but for septic. And they lost in court and they all moved back. They left. And another more progressive group bought their houses. And so part of what their advanced scouting team, they will send several older, wiser men to look at a target destination to see if it really is all those young people say it is. And that's one of the things they have to look for. Are we going to get into trouble? So.
Yeah, interesting too that they wouldn't say, okay, we lost. A lot of English would say, okay, we lost, now we're just going to have to do what they said. They said, no, we're just leaving.
Yeah, no, we will. You move to keep your faith. You're not going to give it up just because you lost in, secular courts.
So as part of your research, as you've mentioned, so with the schools, you were traveling to communities outside of New York. This is a very broad question, so you can take it however you want. But can you tell us about your field experiences, both close to home and far away? And
oh, I've had good times.
Yeah.
I've had some strange times.
Yeah.
I will never forget staying with a friend. We were researching schools in a very short-lived settlement in Perry County, Ohio. And this is, I mean, it had to be one of the most picturesque homes I'd ever seen. It was in a valley. You had pasture. The outhouse was above a little stream, so you had to go down the cinder block steps and around this little path and cross a little bridge to get to the outhouse. If you don't think that was bad at 3 a.m, let me tell you, you hear these sounds of nature, and you don't know what you're going to meet. Being joined in the outhouse by traveling companions, that was kind of weird. But being there for butcherings, peeling peaches, and one of the people peeling peaches, the husband was a bishop, who goes, gee, my ass is really hurting from peeling all, It's also the same person who asked me to pick him up some peppermint schnapps because he was feeling under the weather. Okay, so they're not teetotalers. And then I'm discovering relatively late in my research how many Amish Schwarzenhuber winemakers there were. My husband likes to share notes with a hard cider maker. They refer to it as zippy, when the cider gets zippy. But mostly it was just sitting there with people. This close friend, one of the first women I met, being there with her family, we would sort the strawberries because they would keep the culls to can and send them on. And just spending hours sorting the strawberries and talking. My kids would be playing with their kids. A whole range of experiences. I flew out to Missouri. This was doing research for the Amish, to meet some of the people from Perry County who'd settled out in Missouri. And talk about flying into I flew into Kansas City, but I mean driving to the middle of nowhere. I mean, the GPS just stopped. And asked some people on the side of the road how to get, the address was Rural Route 1. Not very helpful. How to get to the Amish. And she said, well, you go by the grain elevator. And I guess she decided from my accent that I wouldn't know a grain elevator from. So she explained very carefully what a grain elevator was. So English more than the Amish. So anyway, I make it to the place, and that evening, when it was only 90 degrees instead of 100, we're walking down the road to deal with watermelons. And she said, by the way, we're not Amish anymore. And I went, oh, really? Since they looked exactly the same as they had been when they were Amish. And they joined a very conservative Mennonite group because they were desperate to find a community with which they could fellowship. And they weren't having any luck with the Amish. So they joined this more conservative Mennonite group. So lots of bizarre experiences, but also funny. Getting up in the morning to discover the house had been invaded by ladybugs and having to sweep them up and throw them in the wood stove. I hate ladybugs now. So a lot of different.
Just a lot of different people.
A lot of different people, different experiences. I am in awe of 8th grade Amish teachers who can teach compound interest, because I would go to those lessons and say, yeah. I mean, they're people and their lives are diverse, and they do fun things and they do sad things. Going to the first Amish funeral I went to, which was for a little boy the same age as my son, who'd gotten killed. They were taking logs out of the forest, and it's frozen. It's so you can pull the logs out, And he was doing what you'd expect any 12-year-old boy to do. He was riding, standing up on the log, surfing, Wasn't this fun? Until it hit a bump, the log flew up, he fell down, log came down. And I went to the family's house. I brought lots of bread because I knew they'd have to feed people and wouldn't have time to do all the baking. So I go in and everybody's sitting there. And I'm English. I went up to the parents to express my grief and to the grandparents on either side, people I knew well. And then I sat down next to someone I knew. And you just, it's a wake, you're sitting there. And then I watched Amish people go in. And they shook hands, yes, with the grandparents and the parents. And there was my inclination was to hug. I knew at least not to do that. But then they shook hands with everybody in the congregation. And it was the first time I realized that this was a loss, certainly a loss of a child, a grandchild. This was a loss of a potential church member, a potential spouse. This was a community loss in a real, in a way I'd never appreciated. And then afterwards, in the talk today, I'll talk about someone remembering Harvey 24 years later, and it's this fellow. Afterwards, there was bread left over, and they canned it. And I thought, oh, you can can bread. How very interesting. So odd little things like that. So just.
Well, that's fascinating. The idea of the loss of a child is usually such an art, such a personal.
Yeah,
I think it's of it. In a communal group, how different that is.
And understanding the church in a new way. I mean, I feel like over the nearly 40 years, just redefining what church was through my experience. Not for me, of course, but trying to understand what church was for them. And the Gemay is really community, and it's everything. It's everything you do. It's those with whom you live. It helped understand the loss when a child leaves the community, which has happened a number of times. Young people I know have left. Some have come back, some haven't. And understanding what that means, understanding what church is as you make this pilgrimage through life as an Amish person. So.
It makes a lot of sense too. So how isn't a very high percentage do join the church?
The more conservative, the higher the percentage. But there are those. Our world makes inroads. I know even showing up, I remember my son used to be very attached to this little Fisher-Price tape recorder. And my friend said, can you have him leave that home? Now, my son was very interested in this Amish world. He became very, he told Fanny at one point, he must have been about 4, he says, there are these things called plugs, and you can plug it in, and then you don't need matches to turn the lights on. Fanny got a kick out of this, but she still wanted him to leave his tape recorder at home. There was one time I had brightly colored mittens on. And I discovered later Fanny's kids were asking for English English mittens like mine. So I stopped wearing those mittens. I think, have I been a force for bad? And so far they keep letting me come, so I'm hoping not. But, there are those who leave. There are the English world. It's a porous border as tightly as they try to keep it.
What do you think is the most common misconception about the Amish?
They're all the same. Yeah. And it's hard not to see that because, popular media just can't begin to show the diversity. That's why I think research about the Amish is so important. People say this is a minority group, a very small minority. There aren't many Amish people. But they have a huge social impact for the size of the group. And, since they may be coming to an area near you, I think it's important. Plus, I mean, I never thought I'd be devoting my whole life to researching the Amish. I thought I'd do this study of language shift and language maintenance, and then I could work with other minority groups and have implications for other kinds of social. I think the Amish have a lot to teach us about faith, about what having faith really means, about the challenges of having faith, about the challenges of encountering and trying to work with and hoping to compromise with groups defined by their faith. And I wish there were, that's why I think research of the Amish is so important, because they're not all the same, because modern media can't show that diversity, and because understanding that diversity is important.
So you've retired now, you're a professor emeritus from SUNY Potsdam.
Mm-hmm.
That's where you spent the majority of your career.
Mm-hmm.
How did your research on the Amish and other plain groups impact your teaching there?
That's a good question, because I didn't get to focus. I mean, I could certainly bring them into my classes,
right,
in linguistic anthropology and how to do field work. And my justification for making all of my students learn the phonetic alphabet was that some of the people they might work with would not allow themselves to be taped. And so if you're going to write down that down, I could torture students and give them real life examples of why they needed it. I hope, and I don't want this to sound weird. I hope, learning to interact with people who were very different from me in about every possible way made me more accepting of the diversity of my students. I confess I'm still leery about the student who sat in the front row and kept rubbing his tongue ring across his lips. But I like to think that encountering different people helped me encounter different people. It also gave me great street cred in the classroom, because I was someone actually doing research with a cultural group. And in upstate New York, where diversity is truly hidden, I mean, it's certainly there, but it's truly hidden, people don't have much exposure to groups, or don't think they have much exposure to groups that are different. So
you've talked before about these friendships, these relationships that have developed over time. How have your relationships with Amish individuals and communities grown and evolved over the years?
Well, they grew from informants to friends. At one time, I had a much wider acquaintance with people, and the letters show that. There are people in all sorts of communities that I'm no longer in touch with, which I find sad, but I'm simply not. I'm not traveling anymore. I'm not doing that. So the active friendships, the ones that get reinforced through regular visiting and drinking coffee and this, is now a smaller group. They tend to be the descendants of that first woman, Sue. I'm in touch with one daughter-in-law, granddaughter-in-law, who's not in the same settlement anymore, so I don't see her. She'll call me on the phone, which is an odd thing for me. Otherwise, they tend to be the sisters and the children and the grandchildren of that first, of the first Schwarzentrooper woman I met, Fanny. So, and the get-togethers are different. They're for special occasions. I don't visit schools. I don't see their kids in school. I still get invited to frolics, good frolics like potato chip making, or barn raisings. I wasn't home. The husband of one of these close friends passed away. And I wasn't home to go out to the funeral, which of course I would have. I still, it's hard for me to imagine because it was a sudden death and he's younger than me. But, this is rambling again. They've expanded and they've condensed and they've changed. Now they're friends. Yeah. They're not Amish friends. They're just friends that I have to go visit because they don't pay their phone bill.
Yeah.
Kind of thing.
Yeah. So definitely, especially now that you're retired, you're going because you just want to spend time together.
I'm not helpful in the same way. I don't give rides to people anymore unless they're coming on the noontime bus and they're special people. Otherwise, I don't give rides to people anymore. I don't go to BJ's to pick up stuff for them. So all of those ways in which I would help, which I felt compelled to do, these people, had given me my professional career. So, I had this sense of needing to help, but I don't do that anymore. So
we're recording this interview to celebrate your donation of your research files to the college archives here to the Young Center. Tell us about the materials you've donated.
Well, there are 2 boxes of just correspondence. These are just letters that I accumulated over time. I wish when I first started keeping the letters, I never thought of keeping my letters to them. So it's one-sided correspondence. But from the beginning, the letters were useful in my research. I don't want to speak for the Amish if they can speak for themselves. And using their letters gave me a way of letting them speak for themselves. So there are 2 boxes of just correspondence. There are a couple boxes of materials relating to the school research, notes from schools, but also correspondence with teachers from each of the different schools. And I just left those with the notes because I felt like they made more sense to be with the notes. There's some crossover. One of the teachers, we just corresponded after I was done visiting schools. And so there's some of that in the general correspondence. There's a lot of stuff related to school teachers' meetings. One of the very good friends I made early on was an older Mennonite woman. And I would go and stay at their house. At first it was because Amos Hoover put me in touch with her. And she would teach me Deutsch. And there was a time I actually wrote to her in Deutsch and she would write little things back. But her daughter was growing up and first was a teacher's aide and then this. So I would go to the teachers' meetings long after I was done researching schools. So there's a whole collection. There's at least a year's worth of Old Order Mennonite teachers' newsletters from the meetings they would hold once a month. And then there are notes from the annual Old Order teachers meetings at Hillside School, which they're for the Old Order Mennonite schools, but there's a lot of crossover between Old Order. A lot of Amish teachers teach in Old Order Mennonite schools and vice versa. There's the research related to my study of New York communities. There's a lot of work, papers related to Schwarzentuber Amish. Those files are incomplete, and I've mentioned this to you because, sometimes I was actually efficient and just did it on the computer. The raw notes are in there. Many of them aren't transcribed because, as I would tell my students to take really good notes and transcribe them after every field experience and keep them organized and da-da-da-da-da. I didn't practice what I preached, and so there's a lot of stuff in there that's really raw. When I did do that and have it printed off, that's in there. There's language data from those early years. There are copies of my work, of papers given, a lot of which never went into print or anything. There's copies of other people's things. Like, when Don came up to see me, he gave me a copy of his field notes. He did do things right. And that's in there. But there are also copies of an Amish person that I got to know when I was in the fellowship down here. Gave me all these notebooks he had. And I made copies and used them in the women's book and stuff. So there are copies of his work in there. I spent a lot of time doing research at both the Muddy Creek and the Heritage Historical Library, and made copies of a lot of articles that I would never have found otherwise. Things that are hard to access through interlibrary loan, I left in there. Things that, any researcher worth his salt can look up. I figured, if it was stamped High Library, I thought there was no reason to donate it to the library archives. I hope I got them all. And I think that's about it. There is correspondence with other English researchers. A lot of that was email. I will try and print that off and send to you if you think it'd be useful. The correspondence with English is more, that was just personal, but it was all part of the work. I think that's pretty much it. There were some other things. Yeah. There's a school bell, which that's a special thing. Sue Wiki, whose classroom was the first one I ever visited. I stayed with her out in Michigan. We visited classrooms together. She was the first Amish woman I ever met. And when she passed away, her family gave me her school bell. And, it sat on her desk. It sat on my desk for a while. There were a couple more dolls. The story of the dolls. There are several Schwarzentroober diaper bags, which sounds odd. There's an adult one. These are all handmade. The Schwarzentroopers make them themselves. I've seen them made. There are 2 children's diaper bags that a little girl would carry to play dolls with. There were wedding invitations and wedding ephemera because I found these so different. The invite that comes on a postcard or a half a piece of paper, and then the handmade invitation, and then the printed invitation, and the songbook, and the little bookmark, and the odd collection of pens. That was just a bizarre. I began collecting. Some of them were wedding gifts. You picked up. They gave you a pen. Some of them, I'd visited Amish business. They had a pen. I took a pen. It is in that wooden box. I don't know if I told you. Is a handmade Schwarzentroober pencil box.
No, you mentioned that.
I realized later I probably hadn't. It was made by a fellow named Jacob J. Schwarzentroober, my friend Fanny's husband, and he was making them for his kids, and he made a couple for my kids, and my kids said, "I'm not taking this." So I have one of them. I have no idea what happened to the other. And that's what held all those Amish pens. So that's a child's dress. Could be male or female because that's what all Schwarzentroober babies wear. So
you've referred to Dr. Donald Craybill. His papers are also here
Mhm,
in Elizabethtown and had worked in Elizabethtown for decades as a mentor of yours. Did you have other mentors that you should tell us about?
I don't think I would call them mentors. In the same way. Influences.
Influences, okay.
I did end up collaborating, say, with Steve Nolt, who I would certainly count that in. But, I worked with Steve as a colleague and a collaborator. Don was there from the beginning, pushing me through, saying, "You should do this." I told him I wanted to write a book about Schwarzentroopers. He said, "Well, the book about women is what we really need." So I was swayed. And grateful because it became a very different way to understand the women I knew. Early on, Werner Enninger, who's since passed away, whose research on Amish English and language was instrumental. Amos Hoover was a godsend. His book on, he just put out his book on English. Well, I would go to his library, and he had this box of stuff on the shift to English. And at one point he said, I should give this to you. And his wife said, wait a minute, Amos. Nora was tough. Nora, any notion of subservient women. Nora was tough. She said, Amos, you said you were going to write that book. And I'm like, damn. But he let me use his box of stuff. And throughout the years has always been there, has always been encouraging. Came up to visit me, and he and Nora, and we visited friends. So Amos Hoover was an instrumental close friend. David Luthi at the Heritage Historical Library. Was a very different relationship, but I found his help invaluable. Trying to think about my friend Mary Shirk, who's not an academic, but she and her daughter Dorcas went with me to interview Amish women when I was working on the women book here in Lancaster. I couldn't have gotten half of what I did if it hadn't been for them, and for the fact that Dorcas was nursing a baby while we talked. I mean, that connection altered everything. I was not just another English person researching the Amish. An influence to me, certainly. I've known her for 30 plus years. I'm trying to think of other scholars, and Mark Loudon, for example, with language. And Mark has come to the area. Mark, I'm in awe of his language skills. Michelle Wolf, who worked with Werner, and I met her here in Lancaster County. There was a guy named Ivan Glick who introduced me to people. So there were a lot of influences. Louise Stoltzfus, you have her papers here. The first person I ever talked to about Amish women. First ex-Amish, I was writing about Beachy and fellowship and Old Order women. So a number of people whose interest, whose help, influenced my work. And I wouldn't have done what I've done without these people. And there are references to all of them in that collection of materials.
It's kind of beautiful because you talked so much about Amish community, but you had your own community.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. And it's hard because, I was always envious of people like Don and Steve. Okay, they got a few libraries right there. I had to get on a train to go to Elmer because I refused to drive through Toronto, and spend time away. I had to come down here. There was nobody to talk to. And these were people I could talk to.
We really want to thank you for donating your papers to Elizabethtown. I'm very excited about all the correspondence and all the potential that has for students here, other researchers. It's fantastic.
I am so grateful that you have taken it. I hope it will be useful. It's just it felt really odd to be boxing it up and trying to put the letters into some kind of chronological order. It was amazing to me how clear the memories were. And so I hope that people will find it useful. I'm so grateful that you have it. Thank you for accepting it. It gives me such pleasure that you have it.
We're happy to have it. I love that it's in people's own hand. You're hearing their voices.
And as I say, those letters enabled me. My goal was I'm not Amish. I've never been Amish. I didn't grow up in an Anabaptist household. It's not my heritage. It's not my faith. So I don't want to speak for the Amish. And those letters, I hope, let them do the talking. Or at least that's what I tried.
So is there anything else you want to share?
No, just thank you so much.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you.
So-
Thank you for doing this interview. Thank you
Oh,
again
it's
for
been
the
my
papers.
pleasure.
We're excited to start processing them.
Yeah. Well, and as I
Thank you
say,
very
if,
much.
if you have any questions, just get in touch. And I'm happy to help in any way.
Thank you. All right. Thank you very much, Karen.
My pleasure.